So God makes a number of covenants in the Bible. We're going to focus on 3 of them. We're going to start here with a covenant that God makes with Abraham, referred to as the Abrahamic covenant. This is, well, as all of them are, an incredibly important covenant, but this one is in many ways the kind of the beginning of this family, this Jewish family, and it's the covenant that we're going to see in the New Testament that the Apostle Paul understands to be the covenant to which Christians are added in, grafted onto the vine by way of Jesus. It's into this Abrahamic covenant that Christians are brought, and for this reason that Christians argue or believe that Abraham is their forebearer, just as Abraham is a forebearer for Christians, for Jews, and for Muslims. All right. So while many people speak of a covenant as a kind of promise, particularly the Abrahamic covenant, which people will sometimes say is an unconditional promise, many covenants, particularly those in the ancient world from which the biblical covenants are derived, are more like what we think of today as a contract, right? With 2 parties joining together and making a kind of an agreement. In Genesis 15, we see this practice enacted, though it is in a somewhat modified way, which we'll get to in just a minute. I actually have here an example of one of these kind of contracts, covenants, this is from 700 BCE, that's 700 years before Jesus was born, a treaty between King Ashur-nirari of Assyria and somebody named Matailu. Now, I have no idea who Matailu is, nor really know anything about this king of Assyria, but it's a pretty interesting little piece, and we can see how serious this was. So here's what it is. This spring lamb has been brought from its fold, not for sacrifice, not for a banquet, not for purchase. It has been brought to sanction the treaty between Ashur-nirari and Matailu. If Matailu sins against this treaty made under oath by the gods, then just as this spring lamb brought from its fold will not return to its fold, Matailu, together with his sons, daughters, officials, and the people of his land, will not return to his country and not behold his country again. This head is not the head of the lamb. It is the head of Matailu. It is the head of his sons, his officials, and the people of his land. If Matailu sins against this treaty, just as the head of this spring lamb is torn off, may the head of Matailu be torn off as well. So they took this pretty seriously. So how does the Lord enact the covenant with Abram? It's still Abram at this point. In Genesis 15, we can see this practice enacted, though it's in a somewhat modified way. That is, it's a little different than the kind of procedure we just saw with the king and Matailu. So here we read, the Lord said to Abram, bring me a heifer 3 years old, a she-goat 3 years old, a ram 3 years old, a turtle dove, and a young pigeon. And Abram brought him all of these, cut them in 2, and laid each half over against the other. Again, we see this business where he lays out the animals on both sides and creates a kind of path down the middle. Now as the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell on Abram, and lo, a dread and great darkness fell upon him. Then the Lord said to Abram, know of a surety that your descendants will be sojourners in a land that is not theirs, and will be slaves there. And they will be oppressed for 400 years. But I will bring judgment on the nation which they serve, and afterward they shall come out with great possessions. As for yourself, you shall go to your fathers in peace. You shall be buried in a good old age. Now when the sun had gone down, and it was dark, behold, a smoking firepot and a flaming torch moved between these pieces, passed between these pieces. I want to stop here for a second And recall something, that in Exodus, which we haven't gotten to yet, but in Exodus, where Moses is leading the Israelites, the Hebrew people, out of Egypt, where they've been enslaved, which is what's just been referred to in this previous text, he leads them as a cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. A pillar of fire by night, which is very similar here to a fire pot or a flaming torch. So what we seem to have is we have God moving between the two halves of the animals here. This is God who led them out, and who again here is like a flaming torch, like a pillar of fire. And in this case, God is passing between these animals, but Abram is not. Right? Remember that in the previous picture of an agreement or a covenant, we saw both parties moving between the animals, and in each case, they were presumably, what they're doing is warning each other that if they don't abide by the agreement they're making, that they'll be killed in the same way that these animals were killed. Their heads will be torn off, right? But there's not that kind of tit for tat thing going on here, right? God is making the covenant. Abram is asleep. A great darkness had fallen upon him. So in this case, it appears that the covenant is fully on God's side. It's all gift, in a sense. So just having told you that this is all gift on God's side, it now appears that there's something that Abram, or Abraham now, is supposed to do. He's supposed to circumcise. And it looks as if this is something like kind of tit for tat. But notice that it's not that sort of thing. In this case, the covenant of circumcision is a reenacting of the original covenant. Notice they're both cutting. They're cutting a covenant. So circumcision, as I expect most of you already know, right, is an ancient practice that's been carried out by Jewish parents for more than 3,000 years, an initiation rite for Jewish newborn baby boys. Normally it takes place in a ceremony called a brit or a bris milah, or just a bris, with family and friends gathered around to welcome the child into the Jewish community. It is an incredibly important identification mark here, right? This is going to become one of the key identifying marks of the Hebrew people. Milah or milah is Hebrew for the covenant of circumcision. So notice again how the covenant with Abraham and the circumcision, the covenant of circumcision, go together. It's also important to notice that Abram's name is changed to Abraham at this point in the story. Now, we'll talk about names again at some future point, but it's important to see that God changes people's names sometimes in important moments. In the first few verses of Genesis 17, where we read about the circumcision, we hear God saying to Abram, "I am God Almighty. Walk before me and be blameless, and I will make my covenant between me and you." And then Abram fell on his face, and God said to him, "Behold, my covenant is with you. No longer shall your name be Abram, but your name shall be Abraham." Right? So something big is going on. This covenant not only creates a new relationship, but it changes, apparently, who Abram is. Name is a very important thing. "And now this is my covenant, which you shall keep," God says. "Every male among you shall be circumcised. You shall be circumcised in the flesh of your foreskins, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and you. He that is 8 days old among you shall be circumcised, every male throughout your generations, whether born in your house or bought with your money from any foreigner who is not of your offspring." So notice it's not just genetic, but anybody, including their slaves who were in their homes, were expected, any males were supposed to be circumcised. "Both he that is born in your house and he that is bought with your money shall be circumcised. And so shall my covenant be in your flesh, an everlasting covenant." Remade each time each new generation comes along. In a sense, this covenant is being renewed, a new cutting, right? "Any uncircumcised male who is not circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin shall be cut off from his people." cutting again. For he has broken my covenant. Right, so finally, once again, covenant, berith means cut, and circumcision, brit, bris, is also a kind of covenant, right? They're hooked together. The covenant of Abraham, the covenant of circumcision. God said to Abraham, as for you, you shall keep my covenant. This is my covenant which you shall keep between me and you and your descendants, that every male among you shall be circumcised. Right, so now I want you to go back to the worksheet. We haven't talked yet about what it is that God is giving to Abraham. It's a promise of something. We want to now collect a list of the things that God is promising to Abraham. All right, so that's what you're going to do. You're going to look through the text that I've listed on your worksheet, and then I want you to come back and we'll talk a little bit about the gifts.